Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining. We'll just start in a couple minutes as we let more people continue joining in. Okay, thank you all for joining us today. Welcome to Anti-Black Racism, Health and Healthcare. Please note that you are not audible or visible, but we encourage you to ask questions through the Zoom Q&A function. The session will be recorded and available later at the Hastings Center website, and it should be available later today. And now I want to introduce Michele Goodwin. Michele Goodwin is a Chancellor's Professor of Law at the University of California, Irvine School of Law, and founding director of the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy. She is the recipient of the 2020-2021 Distinguished Senior Faculty Award for Research, which is the highest honor bestowed by the University of California. She is an elected member of the American Law Institute, an elected fellow of the American Bar Foundation, and she is an American Law Institute advisor for the Restatement Third of Tort Remedies. So welcome, Michele, and I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. It's wonderful to be with you all. I am joining from Zurich, Switzerland, and I'd like to ask the panelists, Dr. Faith Fletcher, Dr. Patrick Smith, Dr. Keisha Ray, and also Virginia Brown, Dr. Brown, to all come on screen with me. And thank you all so much for being part of this very important conversation and also important undertaking that has taken place. Now, what we're going to have is a conversation today, but before we launch into that conversation, I want to start with a round robin of my panelists to have them introduce themselves slightly, doing something a little bit different, because I want to ask them what's been critical to them in their careers as they introduce their background. And I want to start off with you, Dr. Faith Fletcher, as you undertook and led this effort.
Thank you, Dr. Goodwin, for moderating for us today. We're so happy to have you as a person that has really influenced the direction of bioethics. So I am a public health scientist as well as trained in bioethics, and a lot of my work really focuses on stigma, marginalization, bias, all of these factors that really influence healthcare engagement. I generally employ a community engaged approach. Most of my work is empirical. I use that empirical work to really influence bioethics dialogue around women's reproductive rights, as well as centering perspectives in addition to anti-racism and bioethics, as well as public health. So happy to be here. We believe that health equity and disparities in health and healthcare is really reflected in this report, and it reflects an interdisciplinary approach to really thinking about issues of ethics, issues related to health equity. So thank you again for being here with us today.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to turn to Dr. Keisha Ray. What has motivated you in your career, in addition to explaining about yourself? What's been your motivation?
So hello, I'm Keisha Ray. I have a PhD in philosophy. Most of my bioethics work is about the socio-political and cultural determinants of Black people's health, including the pathways that racism affects Black people's overall, or sorry, general inequities in health and access to healthcare. I also do a little bit of the ethics of biotechnology and about how can we talk more about social inequities in health, particularly those that affect Black people in medical school curriculum. I'm also the director of our medical humanities program here at McGovern Medical School. And most of the motivation behind my work, some of it is personal, some of it is directly related to my own experiences with racism in healthcare and how that influenced my it hindered me to do the work that I want to do. It hindered me to, just live out those passions, to play with my dog and those kinds of things. And so some of it is personal, some of it is seeing family members who have been discriminated against and how that affected their health. And then also my students, I hear different stories from them when they are in the clinics, when they start that in their third year of medical school, and some of the racism that they see and some that they experience themselves in their own career. And so a lot of what I do is just motivated by wanting better for Black people and wanting them to not die preventable deaths, and the heartbreak that sheds on entire families and communities, and leaves a legacy in the Black community. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And it's so important what you've raised, this communications that you've had with your students, experiences that you've had yourself. And we're going to turn to that because these are full-lived lives that you all have. So as you write about these very important issues framed within the bioethics and public health context, the reality is that there's a duality as well that undergirds this. It reminds me of the work of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, on one hand, writing as a pioneering sociologist about race in America, and yet at the same time experiencing the blade and slice of racism in America from his own vantage point. And that kind of duality is very important. It informs the work, and at the same time, there's also a kind of double effect because you're also affected by exactly the work. All right, I'm going to turn now to Dr. Smith.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Goodwin, for being here, and all of you here. My name is Patrick Smith. I'm at Duke University. I direct the bioethics program at the Trent Center for Bioethics, Humanities, and History of Medicine at School of Medicine, and also teach bioethics and theological ethics at Duke University Divinity School. And so for me, what motivates me in many ways is just I come from a family that where some of the members were involved in the civil rights movement. I had an uncle who was a longtime civil rights leader in Birmingham. When he would travel the country, he would often come and visit wherever, various cities. And if any of the relatives were nearby, he would call us and ask us to meet him for lunch, dinner, or whatever the case may be. And so he would often ask, what is it that we're studying, working on, researching? I'd often tell him, and then he would sit there and nod and kind of look as if he's somewhat unimpressed by all of that. But then he would just simply say, just don't forget about the people. And that's something that always stuck with me, that as I think about the kind of work that I'm engaged in, dealing with these issues of healthcare disparities, questions of bioethics, that at the end of the day, that all of that will be for naught if I were to forget about the people. And so when I started into this work of bioethics, I started as an ethics director of a hospice care center. I was thinking myself, helping others think about what does it mean to kind of value life at the end of life. But then when I started working with particular populations and communities, it became very clear to me that we can't ask the question, what does it mean to value life at the end of life, without asking the question of what does it mean to value life before the end of life. And that's what really opened up, I think, the parameters for me to think about these questions of bioethics and bringing social ethics, and particularly aspects of religious social ethics, to bear on conversations in bioethics to think about questions of health justice.
Thank you so much for that. And we're going to round it out then with Dr. Virginia Brown. Also the same question that I put to the panelists.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the chance to be here. As Michelle said, Dr. Goodwin said, I'm Virginia Brown. It's hard to figure out how to describe, so I'll do my best by saying this. I'm an ethicist. Okay, at the core of what I do. I'm a medical sociologist by academic training. I'm a public sociologist, most importantly. What does it mean how do you take academic information and bring it to the community in a bidirectional way that makes sense? I'm a community engaged scholar in the Department of Population Health at Dell Medical School here in Austin, Texas. So in that role, we do a lot of CBPR work. So how do I think about health, healthcare, inequity, using this training in lots of different ways? So a quick answer, in my research in particular, I look at protecting the autonomy of people who live with serious mental illness using a document that can give in advance people's preferences and of care during a mental health crisis. It is about health. It is about at your most vulnerable in a mental health crisis. How do you protect yourself? All of this is informed. You asked that fundamental question, sort of, how did you get into this? Quite by accident and then very deliberately. I found myself working for Marion Gray Secundi. I was in the Department of Family Medicine at Howard University College of Medicine, and I was working for Marion. Our families go back 100 years. And I remember sitting in her office one day, I remember sitting there realizing that this is social justice work. My family has been long pioneers in the legal battle of desegregating Philadelphia and writing some of the original laws. So that's always sort of been part of the flavor, but that's just like how you grew up. That's how I grew up, right? And it is what it is. But it was very clear to me that one of the areas that had not experienced that was health and healthcare. That freedom that had been fought for and continued to be fought for did not extend to this place. So as I said, it was all of a sudden and then very deliberately. That's when I went back to graduate school. That's when I started on this path. It's my second career. So I came to it with a very deliberate framing over time, and I'm delighted to be here talking with you all and working with my marvelous colleagues. It's been a great experience.
I so appreciate that. Now, to level set for our conversation and for the audience, we're going to have a deepened conversation, not just pre-formatted questions, because I think that that's not really the full value of what it is that you all can offer. And I hope that you'll bear with me as we have that deepened conversation, because I so appreciate the deep knowledge that you bring to these issues, and even just how you've level set right now in terms of what brings you to this, the passion behind it, your family's histories are really so important. But to get just a couple of things on the table that are important, I want to turn first to Faith. And if you don't mind, I so think it's important, and it's really the legacy of all of our foreparents and so forth, that we understand the importance that has been earned by the titles you have. But I hope that you'll allow me to call you by your first names and call me by mine too as we engage in the conversation. Okay, because I acknowledge that our grandmothers worked really hard such that they would not be called girl, and our grandfathers too, not boy. And I think that that is an important part of our legacy. There's a Supreme Court case, actually, where Mary Hamilton fought a Black woman fought to be called by her name in U.S. court and not just simply girl. So I just want to level set with that. But I want to start first with you, Faith. In leading this report, not only why you did it, but what kind of energy did it take to actually do this, such that people understand that it's not just academic?
Thank you so much for that question, Michelle. This is an excellent question. I think that my chair recently, and I want to highlight that I am an assistant professor at Baylor College of Medicine in the Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy. And my chair was describing actually the report recently, and she said, how long have you been working on this, Faith? And I started thinking, and I was like, actually all of my life. So as Virginia is stating, it's just a combination of lots of different life experiences and our career paths. So for me, beginning my work in bioethics, completing PhD studies in public health, the pandemic really helped us to see that healthcare disparities were exacerbated. And this was a public health crisis that clearly has ethical dimensions, ethical dilemmas, especially for individuals that are underserved and marginalized, even so, especially those that are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So in my perspective, in my work, and I would like the other panelists to also comment on this, I was like, where's bioethics in this conversation, leading this conversation around these health and healthcare disparities? I also was especially interested in understanding the feedback, the lived experiences, and the expertise of Black bioethicists in the scholarship as well as in the media. So we weren't seeing enough of that early on in the pandemic. So I think it just required this concerted effort, this organized effort to really amplify and elevate the work of Black bioethicists, our lived experiences. You described this insider, outsider perspective that we all embody, and many of us working on the report embody, negotiating our positions at our institutions, being overly burdened by DEI work, and also dealing with experiences in our families, chronic illness, people that were disproportionately affected. So we just came together, and it was the time, it was the season. Many before us have really laid the foundation for doing this work, which is the intergenerational focus. And it was just the season that really allowed us to carry out the work that had already been started. So again, in this report, we really acknowledge, we make mention to previous efforts of other Black bioethicists, highlighting the unrecognized and even the undocumented scholarship and the uncited scholarship of Black bioethicists. So if you look at this report, you'll see that there are many different forms of writing, empirical, theoretical, narrative, really representing the versatility of Black scholars. We're very different. We have different approaches to our work, different ways of being, different ways of knowing. So we were able to bring all of those components together, and I think create what we hope to be a seminal report on anti-racism and bioethics.
And we're going to build on that. And I want to turn to you as well, Patrick, in terms of your role with this report and why this report. And then we'll go a little bit deeper because, as you've mentioned, Faith, the role of anti-racism. And it strikes me that there's terminology which we could use today, which would have been apropos 5, 10, 15 years ago, but people would have been stared at 5 or 10 years ago to talk about white supremacy in healthcare during a time in which people said, well, we're post-racial. What's this talk about white supremacy? And that's something from a century ago. And so it also seems that now, and in fact, with people who have died because of recent efforts undergirding white supremacy, it's now on the table to be discussed in nuanced ways. But Patrick, I want to put that question to you too. Why this report?
Yeah, why this report? Yeah, I mean, for me and for the other editors as well, it was really important to engage this intergenerational conversation, right? The idea is that we have to be very clear about what we wanted to do is that we know that Black voices are often erased in these conversations. We wanted to make sure that we acknowledge and highlight those. But even as many of us now in this day, in this contemporary moment, with Black Lives Matters movements, with George Floyd, with a number of different things where we're getting a little bit more airtime. People are maybe hearing us. We have more spaces perhaps to highlight these issues and to sound off and to encourage and to generate a call for people to be responsive professionally and ethically about these things. We recognize, if we have enough of a historical memory, that what we're saying has been said before. Right. And many others have gone before us, and they have said these things in these spaces in bioethics. Many times their voices were marginalized or not taken as seriously. And I think that they were able to agitate, to plant the seeds in a particular way that allow the fruit of what we are able to do at this moment based on their work before. So, one of the things that we often talk about, is this notion of the sitting at the feet phenomena and kind of our cultural tradition, right, to pay homage and respect to the elders, those who have come before, sitting at their feet, just learning from them, being encouraged by them, right? We wanted to take that seriously. We think about the notion of, the African term Sankofa, right? Literally to retrieve, right? To go back and take that which has been forgotten so that it can help provide a pathway to the future, right? So we want to see this as a Sankofa moment at the same time that fuses every moment of time and history together, that highlights the interconnectivity of various communities together at one point in the present, reflecting back to have a pathway towards a future that is marked by a greater sense of health justice. And so I think for me, for many of us, we recognize that we simply stand on the shoulders of giants, that we can see further in the horizon, not because of our own brilliance or greatness, right? As brilliant as my co-editors
But you all are brilliant, but I get it.
But in terms of, but we do build, right, off of the work of so many others. And we just wanted to highlight that. And the other thing, Michelle, I just want to add is that, one of the things we often recognize is that many of the younger scholars of color doing work in bioethics, as they are leaning in, finding their own voice, some of them may be unfamiliar with some of these voices as well. And we thought it was really important to just make sure that a new generation of scholars who are doing work in this area are familiar with some of those resources that can help them perhaps and serve them well as they are trying to lean in their own way, find their own voice and adapt these resources for the present that we're in now for a more equitable future.
I'm really glad that you mentioned this latter point in terms of future generations having the tools at their disposal and connecting them with that history, because if you don't, who will? And I think that is really that kind of duality as well that Faith also spoke to. The privilege of carrying history forward, but also the burden of doing it too. That but for scholars of color in these areas, that sadly the legacies of those who came before would not be carried on, which is really to the detriment of us all. And another point that you made, Patrick, before I turn to this matter of anti-racism and asking Keisha and Virginia to speak to it, is that you've mentioned how pioneers were also perhaps didn't have at their disposal the kinds of privileges that you all have now, that I have. And in the context of law, I think about it within the context of constitutional equality. People often think about Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and others as being the real purveyors of equality. And yet I think about the Black mothers and grandmothers in Alabama and in Georgia who were beaten as they attempted to vote, who protested for equality for all, who made a constitution come alive when in fact they were dispossessed of it. So, the point that you raise, who are the people who actually really do the work that ends up being meaningful, I think is really important. And it's something that still we have to address across medicine, law, public health, and many different areas. And so leading to that, I want to start off with you, Keisha, and then go to Virginia about this question of anti-racism, particularly in a backdrop where now there is a pushback against history, a pushback about learning about the plight of Indigenous people, Asian people, at a time in which we've seen such a dramatic rise of anti-Asian hate in America, a pushback against critical race theory, this kind of notion that anti-racism itself is the problem rather than the problem itself being racism. So Keisha, let me start first with you about this terminology of anti-racism. What is really meant about that in this context, and why is it explored as it is in this report?
Right. So I think, in particular, we focused on anti-Black racism, right? But that doesn't mean that there aren't sort of overlaps, right? There's different kinds of racism that have been addressed in all the different articles in this special issue. There's interpersonal racism addressed, there's structural, there's institutional. And I think what we're seeing, and one of the reasons that makes this special report so special, is that it really talks about how these sort of forms of oppression and how they sort of intersect, and how they intersect in ways that then create poor health. And so it creates this sort of connection to the past, and it doesn't make what's happening right now singular or insular. It says America, its very foundation, the foundations of healthcare, the foundations of even how we talk about health, have these anti-Black origins, and they have these white supremacist origins, and they've sort of left this trail that we're still dealing with today in healthcare, so in these clinical settings, but then also in our own academic institutions, in our own bioethics organizations and the way we practice and whose research matters and what research gets pushed to the forefront. And so when we talk about anti-Black racism, it's really about this moment of having so much information, right? We're at an age where there's just everything is at our fingertips, but at the same time, the more information there is, like you said, the more misinformation there is, the more pushback there is, the more that you see this resistance. And I think it's because people are starting to feel that we are at this moment in time that we are sort of saying we're demanding more, right? We're demanding a change. We're demanding that we address anti-Black racism, but then in all of its legacy of effects. And I think some people feel threatened. I think people feel like the very just sort of foundation, the very threads of America are being changed. And we're saying, yes, absolutely, that's what needs to happen, right? But some people feel like, once you start talking about anti-Black racism, that they just want to hold on so tight to the status quo. They want to hold on so tight. And the status quo is just another way of talking about white supremacy. It really is just saying that white supremacist origins are feeling threatened. And so I think it's really about how bioethicists, particularly those that work in the areas of race, and that tends to be Black bioethicists who work on anti-Black racism in healthcare and in bioethics. I think this is a moment for us to really say, okay, let's survey the information that's already out there. And like Patrick's saying, there's lots that's been done before us, but that doesn't mean that the work is done. And then I think there's room for the scholars like us that are practicing now to contribute. And then there's tons of room for the people, the students that are coming up, right? And so I think that for Black bioethicists to really say, how do we make a way for us, how do we make a space for us to do the kind of work that we want to do and the work that we know is needed? But then also, how do we make a way for those students coming after us to continue to do the work and continue to put a dent in this anti-Black racism? And so it's really about this community. And I think that's one of the reasons why I was happy to join the other editors here, is because I think so many times we talk about anti-Black racism, but part of that that we've discussed as the authors is keeping us separate, right? Keeping us doing the work alone in our office, publishing, chasing that tenure, right? Chasing that promotion, when part of the joy and part of how you get things done is organizing, is community. And I think one of the just really great things about this special issue is it created a community. There are so many authors that were doing this work and I didn't even know about till I see their name and I see their paper. Then I go look them up and see what other things that they're doing. And I'm like, wow, this is great. So really just this idea of community, I think, is one really great way to combat this anti-Black racism that you see in the academy.
So I'm going to turn to you, Virginia, to help us even further unpack what we're talking about when we talk about anti-Blackness. But before I do, for the benefit of the audience, for those of you who don't yet have your hand on this special report, and I suggest you get your hands on this special report, I want to just take you through some of what we have in this special volume. So give me just a moment, because I just want to call out some of this work, starting off with, in the introduction, addressing anti-Black racism in bioethics, responding to the call, on the shoulders of giants, a reckoning with social justice, bioethics rooted in justice, the ways forward. Speaking volumes, the Encyclopedia of Bioethics on Racism. Anti-Blackness as a chronic condition. I mean, do you all hear me as I walk through just these titles alone of what we have in this special report? Next, this, critically important. I mean, we could do a whole weekend retreat just around any one of these issues. Take, for example, is trust enough? Anti-Black racism and the perception of Black vaccine hesitancy. I mean, talk about that just in a period of COVID and beforehand. And then also, and again, I could just go through all of these, and I do want to just lift out these titles because they matter, and I want you all to go to them and think about them. The courage to see, anti-Black racism and geographics, and even taken up issues that are intersectional, and all of these are intersectional and interdisciplinary, womanist ethics as a contribution to the field of bioethics, and testimonies and healing. I'll come back to some of those other titles as well, but I do just want for the viewing and listening audience, for those who are engaging, to just understand the depth of what is in the special report. And so, Virginia, if you could help further center what anti-Blackness, what you think about within the context of anti-Blackness, and why that's important, when sometimes people might say, well, doesn't that just segregate out Black people in a way that's not helpful to the discourse?
Oh, I have so many thoughts. I don't think that we say that to our Jewish brothers and sisters. Okay, I don't think we lay claim to their centers, their work, their writing about the Holocaust and conditions to this day as not being scholarly enough or whatever. So I had to say that to say the following. When we think about anti-Black racism, it is a call and a request for people to understand that you are only one fill in your specialty group moment away from experiencing racism. So if you can't understand this, you don't understand who you are in the greater scheme of things. So I want to tell a quick story and then list 5 important points. This past weekend, I had a conference thing that we did for my program. And one of my students was just saying, sort of matter of fact, after it was over, because the conversation was a collaborative inquiry. We were talking about, engagement and what does community engagement mean. And my student said to me, having gone to work where they were asked to take the vitals of a patient in a room, the student was said by the patient in the bed, "Oh, look, it's an Oriental. I've had one of them." And my student was nonplussed, had no idea how to respond. It was like, did you eat me or did you have Chinese food? Like, what's going on here? And she was looking to me, and I do have permission to share that story. I want to make sure everybody's clear on that if we don't understand the dynamics and the dimensions that racism can fall into, we will be blind to what happens. We will be blind as citizens. We will be blind as teachers and trainers and educators of the next generation if we don't understand this fundamentally. So I tell that story to say these key things. When we think about why this report, why the conversation around anti-Black racism, it's to talk about openly and actively the policies, practices, and structures that conflate Black scholarship as service, okay? That conflate Black scholarship as identity work, not a scholarly endeavor. That this is not diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Please don't look to us for that. That's a very different path. This study, this work that we've done is about how anti-Blackness has infiltrated the world of health and healthcare, and that we want to bring formerly marginalized voices to the center in addressing the inequities that exist, and to shed light on this, to make sure, as Keisha talked about, how the range and breadth and depth of Black scholars is lifted up and acknowledged, as Keith said, as Faith mentioned, and as Patrick has talked about, how we go back and gather the past, okay, and bring it forward. And most importantly, for those of us who are, trying to hang out on that tenure line, trying to get to that odd promised land, that much of the work that we do, especially in a school of medicine where I sit, is prioritizing empirical work is the only epistemology that is valued and that is known. And that is incomplete way of understanding that it is the lived experiences of people that help shape what we investigate. and that's critically important. So trying to draw attention to these areas is critically important. And thank you for that question, Michele.
I think the outcomes help to tell us so much, and who gets to talk about those outcomes and how, right? When we think about the glaring rates of maternal mortality in the United States, right? And how if you're a Black woman in Mississippi, you're 118 times more likely to die by carrying a pregnancy to term than by having an abortion. What causes that? What is underneath that? And how nationally Black women are 3.5 times more likely than their white counterparts to die during pregnancy in the United States, and how that only magnifies in certain states and counties. So that's a national figure, but then, you look in some places and it's 10 times more likely, 15 times more likely, 17 times more likely. Or you look at rates of cardiac death, or back to Mississippi, but really this could be anywhere, because we can talk about Georgia, Alabama, we could talk about New York City, right? How 80% of the cardiac deaths in the state of Mississippi during pregnancy happen to be amongst Black women, right? And we could go all across the country looking at the highest rates of X and how that happens to be Black people. And so to the point that you're making about why centering this is also in part of a legacy that's undeniable, that the chains and threads of American slavery, as hard as it may be for people to conceptualize, still live and linger with us, that those vestiges have not been completely taken away. And that in fact, if we were better students of our history, then we would understand that those shackles did not fall just because slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment. Being better students of history would actually inform us how, one form of slavery died and then thousands of laws were made to keep Black people shackled to a second-class citizenship. And a failure to understand that, a failure to read that in our history, does a disservice to everybody.
And Michele,
So,
may I add to that?
Go right ahead. Absolutely.
That today, in this moment, we are still trying to help our student learners, we call them undergraduate, they're our medical students and our residents, to understand that Black folks experience pain too. So please don't tell me that, as I heard in a meeting a couple years ago, at least Black folks didn't get caught up in the opioid epidemic. Only because our pain was not being treated because, we magically didn't experience it at the same rate and same level and deserve it being treated. These are things that we are still working on undoing. And it is out of the painful legacy of being enslaved in this country and the myths and stories that were told that allowed in the psyche of Americans to subjugate another set of human beings.
Well, you're speaking directly about that legacy of Marion Sims, which carries forward, right? Those horrific experiments carried out on the enslaved Black woman that he kept on his property in the back of his home. And as he wrote about, having his epiphanies in the middle of the night and then snatching them from the depraved conditions in which he kept them and using his cutting tools, his knives and other things, and cutting into their bodies and denying them anesthesia. These legacies continue forward. And to your point, and I'm going to turn to you, Patrick, about the intergenerational play of this work. But to your point, though, Virginia, about the opioid crisis, it seems to me that embedded in that is something else, which is that the way in which we police Black people's bodies. Is there, on one hand, we have coming out of that opioid crisis this concern, so much so that governments would go to sue the pharmaceutical companies and those who were shareholders behind this, and yet a very different response in the 1980s and 90s, when through various reasons, losing jobs, homes, et cetera, that Black people who often did not have medical insurance turned to alleviate and self-alleviate their pain. And those are people who are still serving jail sentences because they did that. Just very different social responses and government responses that also have a lot to do with public health. So Patrick, with this report, as you've mentioned before, it has an intergenerational look and appeal. And I know that you explained a little bit about why so, but I want you to unpack that even more so. Why does it matter that we are intergenerational as we look at the conditions of anti-Blackness in bioethics and in healthcare generally?
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. It's interesting piggybacking off of some of the other comments that have been made, and you so eloquently laid out how racism just continues to evolve in our body politic in so many different ways. And I've often thought about this idea of a racialized imagination, right? We're trying to deal with these symptoms and the consequences, which we absolutely have to do. We have to give attention to how this plays out on the ground. At the same time, we have to highlight this racialized imagination, the fact that all of us have been racialized, whether we like it or not, and simply changing the laws and the policies of our country doesn't immediately root out the racialized imagination, such that when we think about the context in which we find ourselves, or we think about the various traditions that we're a part of. And when I say traditions, I'm not talking about religious traditions necessarily, just traditions, right? The Latin word traduco, that which is carried over, right? We think about that we are all part of communities. We're part of a larger society that carries over values and ideas and ways of thinking and moving and being in the world. Our organizations and institutions, right? Institutions have the benefit, for all of their faults, right, of preserving and transmitting values, right? And what happens is, if this idea of the racialized imagination is still at work from one generation to the next, we see how these things just continue to evolve and say, well, we dealt with slavery, and so all of this is much ado about nothing, right? But we are failing to recognize the way the racialized imagination is still at work, causing these deep health disparities amongst particular communities of people. And I think we have to continue to, again, push and understand that, so we can see the connection, that this is not something that just kind of pops up at moments, but something that may be deeply rooted in, let me speak for the context of the North American context, in the North American context. So therefore, the spade work needs to be done to root that out, right? But that's going to require quite a bit of work. And we think empirically, I'm not an expert, right, in socioepigenetics, right? But we also know that the burdens, right, that have been received in one generation in our bodies, right, carry over and have an impact to the next generation. And so this is not just in the realm of ideology, but it has real life consequences for our bodies, for our communities, how we live, and the quality of our very lives, right? Not just particular communities, I think, but all of us as well.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, in the epigenomics, and so tied to so much of this is, sort of the storytelling that has been amongst Black people intergenerationally speaking to these matters. And it's fascinating that not until, there are biotechnological advancements that then prove exactly what intergenerationally Black people have been saying for a very long time, right? And I think about that within the context of epigenomics. I think about that within the context of studies released by 23andMe a couple years ago, studying the DNA of African Americans and tracing and finding significant aspects of European ancestry in the DNA of African Americans, and that being traced to the line of males, right? As, yes, anchoring the stories that Black women have said for multiple generations of the sexual assault and sexual violence that was carried out on Black women during the period of enslavement here in the United States. So I really so much appreciate you mentioning that. I want to turn to Faith and then Virginia in answering that question, and Keisha too, if you would want, in terms of the point of being intergenerational with this work.
Thank you so much. And all the comments so far really support why this work is needed. And I'll just talk from the perspective of bioethics. And, we discuss how the intergenerational challenges and harms imposed on Black people, as well as other minoritized communities, hasn't sufficiently been addressed by the field of bioethics. So the purpose of this report is really to think about bioethics as a relatively new field. 50 years, we're hearing initiatives from public health, the NIH, conversations around who's being funded, who's not being funded based on topic choice, based on where people work. And then in the field of medicine, similar conversations around discrimination, even against Black and Brown physicians. But this conversation, again, in terms of bioethics, we need to have more of these conversations. And it goes back to the anti-Black racism. So again, as a field, we should be positioned to really address these issues, given the interdisciplinary nature, given our field being rooted in justice. But we can't do that if we don't really start from within to really address the things institutionally and within our organizations, things that have been lingering, as Patrick is talking about, the evolution and the morphing of racism, of anti-Black racism in particular. So, we really reflect back intergenerationally, decades ago. I want to really elevate, because we elevated this in the report, the Creating the Black Agenda in Bioethics meeting. And Michelle, you were also there in 2005.
Yes, I was there, Faith.
That's
exactly
actually
where I met you, Faith.
Yep, we're sitting on the right of me. And again, we have this history where, again, the field adequately hasn't addressed these issues, but there were many people before us working on these issues. And that was an example of an earlier effort that really needs to be elevated and documented even more historically, thinking about all of the people that were there that continue to offer mentorship. Vince Bonham, Vanessa Gamble, the late Dr. Carlton Haywood, Dr. Stephen Shadecki. So all of these people continue to elevate us. And we've heard so much from them. We weren't positioned to carry out this work, but you all are in the position to carry out this work. But we don't want to be the faces of this work, because we know that we're anchored by so many other people that were marginalized and excluded and pushed out and called radical for doing bioethics work, race and racism work in particular. So it's almost like a calling in of those people so that we can work collectively. Our institutions often make it really challenging for Black scholars to work together. And in some ways, we're even discouraged from doing this work together. But we want to change that paradigm. We want to change that narrative, because we can't do this work individually. It's a collective story. It's a collective narrative. There's history. There is a tradition of us carrying this intergenerational dialogue, communication, and mentorship along. So this is something that we hope that we elevated in this report. And yeah, I'll let Virginia jump in.
Yeah, and Virginia and Keisha, I'm interested in hearing from you about this. There's something that strikes me in the answering of this question, and specifically thinking about the terminology of intergenerational study approach. So on one hand, you're speaking to, Faith, what it means to lift up, pay close attention to, learn from, and even honor the legacies of Black bioethicists. And then I'm thinking about, Patrick, the issue that you've raised in terms of intergenerationally the pain and suffering of Black people as subjects, right? As living individuals in what they've suffered. And so to further set the stage for Virginia and Keisha in answering this question, it strikes me that there is a kind of normalcy that has not been interrupted in terms of Black pain as being normalized, Black suffering as being normalized. I mean, when you think about how long it took in this nation until very recently, finally we have an anti-lynching bill, right? 2022, right? And you think about those legacies of pain, people celebrating the lynching of Black people with picnics, bringing children to them, taking photographs. In fact, part of the record of how we have this legacy is that people did celebrate it, and that they did take photos, and that they gathered their families to celebrate around Black bodies being tortured, being set aflame after being lynched and hung in trees. And this is one of the important aspects of the report, is that it looks at issues in an intersectional lens. So, Blackness isn't defined just by a male experience, but that pain also being that which Black women experienced as well, which is true even of American lynching. And so, Virginia and Keisha, as you answer the question, I wonder your thoughts too with this intergenerationality of the normalcy of Black suffering that doesn't have to be, but is treated as a default. Virginia?
I think it's a very complicated premise to work with. And there's something about it that I want to comment on. And what comes to mind is, what is the critical mass, right? That for something to change, it's very slow and then all of a sudden, right? It's not like what we did hasn't been happening, right? Putting this together, that this normative way of looking at Blackness and anti-Black racism as just being, well, that's how it is. There's something that happens when there's just enough of a critical mass to take that extra risk, to come together and to talk about it in community, to figure out how to speak about it, and then how to write about it and how to frame it. That's critically important. And I think that's in large measure what this special issue is that moment where things changed just enough that there were enough of us to do this. This was laborious and we are still tired. That's like a whole nother conversation. But it took the four of us as editors, coming together, understanding each other's strengths, how to do this, how to take care with the words, how to take care with the critiques, how to move this work to delivery, if you'll allow that as a metaphor, for what we did. And there's...
I wonder if you don't mind, I don't mean to interrupt, but since you just mentioned this last point, Virginia, on what it took, because it also seems to me that there's been over time, and we know this through any number across areas of intellectual study, a kind of resistance to centering race in conversation, as intellectual conversation, as a legitimate enterprise. And there takes then a certain kind of energy in explaining why it is a legitimate enterprise when it should in some ways be very obvious, right? One doesn't need you all to do that, right? To just look at the empirics around us in terms of health and to be able to see, well, these are actually critically important conversations to be had. So I just wanted to put that on the table too, because I hear you in terms of what you're saying, in terms of a kind of energy. And I'm thinking your energy that you're talking about is not just the traditional energy of you write and you edit, but there's another kind of added energy to actually having to do this work that centers talking about Blackness.
Yeah, there's a whole other kind of energy, and there's sort of a couple of things. It's like, personally, I chose not to sit on any of my organization's, racial justice anything. And I'm like, this kind of service work, for the way that you value academics' work, will not be valuable. And you don't need me, and I can't tell you this story because they're going to call my boss and go, she looks unhinged, because I am sometimes that angry, right? And that's a very difficult space to navigate. This is a space, this kind of writing, this kind of being in community, as Keisha discussed, this kind of care and labor that had to be taken when you're asking someone to carve away their words, okay? That how do things hit the carving room floor, okay, without the insults and the stabs that are often accompany the kind of, we always talk about, reader number 2, who is rejecting your work. How do we not be that? Okay, how do we come together as a series of folks and bring something different to this experience, to bring forward a kind of empirical narrative discussion about anti-Blackness in health and healthcare. It's not easy, but the point is it can be done.
Mm-hmm. Keisha, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I want to take just a slightly different perspective, going back to your original question that you posed to us about pain and the sort of offshoots of that. I think for me in this project, and it's sort of reinforced that a lot of times academics in general, right? We all didn't get to be these academics because we were lazy or because we didn't care about scholarship. But I think Black academics, we sort of internalize the suffering narrative. The just work really hard, get it done, and then you'll have access to those spoils of the job, the offices, the director positions, the tenure, the promotion, right? And so I think too many times we overwork ourselves, and we don't value rest, we don't value calmness, we don't value vacations, taking time off, self-care. And when you're working on things, when your scholarship is personal, it's extra important to take that time off because there's no escape. Your everyday life, we still function as Black people and all of the hardships that go with that. And then we go home or to our offices and then we work on the same topic. So there's no escape. So that means it's extra important for us to not internalize that the virtue of being mentally, emotionally, and spiritually strong all the time, 24/7, right? But that also comes with community and knowing that you have colleagues where you're okay to be vulnerable. You're okay to say, I'm gonna need y'all to handle this. And because right now I can't. That happened so many times, which is great to have 4 people. There were times where, we all have lives outside of this special report. We were all dealing with, we have partners, some people have children, some people have other projects that they have to get done for promotion. And, many of us had surgeries and had illnesses as we're doing this report. And so having to make sure that we have each other's back so that the way there can be a balance in our lives between our personal lives, the fun part of our lives, our work lives, making sure we're caring for ourselves. And that comes with also making sure that we care for each other and reminding each other that there is a place for rest and that I always joke with him and say, maybe it's the millennial in me, but I'm not going to kill myself for academia, right? I'm going to make sure that I prioritize myself and I prioritize my rest. But I think part of that is that we've internalized that we have to do well, that we are representing ourselves, but we're representing a cohort of Black bioethicists. So we have to show up and we have to show out. And if we don't, then we internalize it and say, well, we messed up. We did something wrong, right? And so I think there's lots of ways to internalize struggle. And I think Black bioethicists have certainly internalized that a lot. And it manifests itself as being overachievers. It manifests itself as accumulating all that vacation time and not taking it, right? It accumulates in taking a vacation every few years. And I think I just want better for Black academics and to value rest and not internalize this sense that we all must struggle because we don't. We all deserve softness and care.
There's so much that is present in what you've just mentioned, Keisha. I mean, underlying it are traditions that speak to the uber excellence of Black people, the sort of twice as good as, 3 times good as, we're in a space in which we're soon to see the first Black woman Supreme Court justice in the United States after over 233 years, the first. And it strikes me that something that had an emotional impact. It should have been for all Americans, and I think certainly for many, but especially for, I think, Black people and Black women, were the ways in which Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson was treated during the confirmation hearings. And even before President Biden announced who the nominee would be, there were people of some repute, or at least who think that they have some repute, issuing comments and writing things about this person will be unqualified, non-qualified, all of that. And even in the space of the names of people who were being considered having these incredibly elite careers. And of course, the candidate was Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. It didn't necessarily stop some of the vitriol and pushback. But then if you look at what the empirics are in terms of what the standards are, she exceeded those of people who sit currently on the Supreme Court, having clerked at every level of clerkship, district court, appellate court, Supreme Court, having been a judge at what will be every level, but even as a district court and appellate court judge, exceeding that of half of the members of the U.S. Supreme Court and so much more. And it seems to me that there is something that is a psychological burden that then is further carried. And it is in both directions, right? It is the need to be overqualified when you're sitting in the company sometimes of people who have not done the work that you have, and then yet at the same time having to live through the stereotypes after.
Agreed. Yeah, that's quick anecdote. My very first week of grad school, Cornell West was the guest speaker for our MLK celebration, and after his lecture, I was the first person in line. I asked a question, and I said, "I'm first year philosophy student. What advice do you have for me?" And he said, "Work twice as hard as everyone else." And I mean, I got it, but again, I just wasn't going to do that, right? I just wasn't going to be the person that internalized feeling inferior in a room and having my CV be who I am. But at the same time, I think a lot of Black bioethicists, it's hard. You have to constantly work against that narrative that you have to be twice as good as the person as everyone else in the room. And I think many of us don't. And so we work ourselves and we work ourselves and we work ourselves till we are exhausted. And we cannot keep doing this anti-Black racist work if we are killing ourselves, right? We have to take care of ourselves to keep being a part of the community.
But
that is also so complicated. Yes, you can, but in just a second, Virginia, because there's a point that I want to lift up. I mean, because even just on that point, really, we could have a whole meeting that's just around what that means, because it seems to me that it takes its own work just simply making sure that people appreciate and the value of doing work in this space. So Faith, I want to read just a little bit from the introduction of the report and turn back to that bioethics meeting that you spoke about from some years ago. So in 2005, in July, and this we have in the special report introduction. In July 2005, and perhaps one of the first organized efforts to strengthen the network of Black bioethicists and develop a concrete action plan to advance bioethical issues, Tuskegee University's National Center for Bioethics and Research and Healthcare convened and sponsored a meeting called Creating a Black Agenda in Bioethics on the university's historic campus. And it's worth noting that it was Dr. Vanessa Gamble who brought folks together in that context. And you alluded to this in your answer before, and then I'm going to turn to you right after this, Virginia. And it seems to me, and we'll perhaps speak quickly to this, that in part of the report's importance is in fact to center and honor those before. And there's a part of the report that specifically speaks to Dr. Marion Gray. And so I wonder if you might be able to just extrapolate on that a little bit to give us a sense of why.
Thank you so much for elevating that. And we worked with an anti-racism task force to develop and carry out the special report, and we will elevate their names hopefully at the end of this forum. But in our conversations, everything seemed to come back to Dr. Marion Gray Secundi. I learned through conversations that some of my mentors were actually trained by her. So it was just a natural selection to really dedicate and create a tribute in her name. Again, it goes back to certain people not being acknowledged appropriately for their contributions to the field of bioethics. And I think what makes this really special for me, and Virginia also has a longstanding relationship. I knew her as the director of Tuskegee's Bioethics Center. I knew her as someone that was very motivated, and I'll never forget her raspy voice, but also as someone who took us to conferences and hey, let's go shopping. I learned about conference shopping from Dr. Marion Gray Secundi, just a very lively individual. But through these tributes, as an editor, reading them, the 7 authors that contributed tributes, I really learned of her impact in a more profound way. That distance that I had from her as a student, I learned that there were other people that really just began to construct their scholarship around Dr. Marion Gray Secundi's presence. And yeah, I'll just, leave it there. I just hope that other people really read that tribute and are impacted in the same way and learn about her activism and her scholarship on race and racism. There's so much to say about her. And I think this is just really the beginning of telling her story and the story of other Black bioethicists who have been involved and were involved in this work early on.
When I think about the work of Dr. Marion Gray Secundi, and in some ways, sometimes our sheroes are rendered invisible. And, as a connection, I think about Dr. Pauli Murray, who from the position of law, both in civil rights as related to sex equality and civil rights as related to race, played such a pivotal role, was the forerunner of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a forerunner in terms of her writing and impact of Justice Thurgood Marshall. In fact, Justice Thurgood Marshall said that it was Dr. Pauli Murray who wrote the Bible of the civil rights movement. And yet, if surveyed, so many people would know clearly of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her work, and of course of Justice Thurgood Marshall, and wouldn't know about Dr. Pauli Murray, even though she wrote both in terms of sex and race the materials that were used by Justice Thurgood Marshall and then also by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg when they were lawyers before they ever served on the court. Virginia, I wonder if you might want to pick up on that, and you also had something to add from before.
Yeah, so sort of 2 things. I wanted to go back to that got to be twice as good discussion and add this. It did enter into our space as editors, right? There, I mean, no doubt. And it was more born out of, is this good enough to go out yet? Is there more? Like, what will, like it's going to go through another round of editing, and just a whole sort of historical burden of, is it good enough? We even had to navigate ourselves to knowing better, right? Like, we know better, but we were still confronted with that negative legacy. So I just wanted to say that we, we're not, it impacts us in many different ways. We know we're good. We know we had something good, but is it yet good enough? We'll it's that representing the race kind of thing still shows up, and that's really what I wanted to comment from the earlier comment.
Here's something general that I want to throw out to the full panel that connects with what you're saying, Virginia, which is a question of, is it worth studying the conditions that uniquely fall upon Black people? Right? It seems to me that is also part of what the struggle is, right? That Black pain, Black suffering has not been treated as a legitimate enterprise worthy of study. And that to elevate it in and of itself has been something that has attracted resistance. And I think it's worth the people who are listening knowing that not only did you edit in this process, but also the editing that you did also went before a peer review process. Does anybody
Yes.
want to speak to that?
Yeah, and I think there's a question that comes before that to get at where we are today, which is through like a really quick story. My grandfather's dad was enslaved. So grandpa lived with my mother and her sister as a child. And when I learned this, I said to my mom, "Oh my God, did you talk about grandpa and his mother being enslaved? What was the discussion about?" My mother's like, "We never talked about that stuff." Not at all. I'm like, "You've got to be kidding me." So we had this long dialogue, for years. Clearly they did not talk about it. But I think we got to start with that. We got shaped as a people to not acknowledge that pain and suffering. We carried it with us. It shows up in ways that epigenetically, as we've discussed, is showing up, that emotionally and socially is showing up, that we have to deal with so that we can take a look at what we're doing ourselves, right? To stop it, right? To as Keisha was saying, I can't, and Keisha, I don't think it's being a millennial. I'm just like, you're just trying to keep us real. You're trying to ask us to shed that and to say, you cannot. But what did they say? You put your mask on first, before you tend to someone else on the plane. If it loses oxygen, you've got to take care of yourself. And not acknowledging it collectively. And so let me bring it to the intergenerational thing, and I'll stop in a moment. I think it's really important when we add to this conversation about the intergenerational nature of this work, that I want to call to people's attention this in particular. What made Marion Secundi so different is that in her intergenerational sharing of her knowledge, she put you at the table next to her and said, "Get busy." Okay? She didn't tell us to wait your turn. She didn't tell us that we weren't old enough or, didn't have enough letters behind our names. Okay? She asked us to get busy. So sharing and being able to be coached, in that sharing is critically important to the intergenerational work that we tried to do as a team of editors and scholars in particular. We have a range of early career to preeminent scholars who are part of this thing. And it wasn't like, oh, you don't have enough letters behind your name, you can't be a part of this. It was like, no, you've got something to say, get it on some paper. We'll work with you and we'll workshop it to make it representative of what you want to say. And I think that's really important when we talk about what are the aspects of intergenerational work. That is one that's really important.
Faith, had you wanted to add into that?
Yeah, thank you for raising that. I think when we talk about labor, we really need to think about labor as emotional, mental, intellectual. And this is what I felt throughout this project. It's hard to describe. I think even having this conversation right now, we're still not at the point where we've really even been able to unpack the process and what's happened. We think maybe down the line we can write more about even the process of engaging in partnership, working with, in collaboration with this task force to develop this work. So that's one part that's really important. But when we think about, and I'm glad you raised the peer review process, because we don't want people to think we just developed these articles and we didn't go through the general rigorous process. That's important to note. So thank you so much for raising that, Michelle. But part of that is when we were really thinking about a list of reviewers, my student was working on it, and it took a long time to really identify people who's suited to really review this work. And when we got, reviewer comments back, as editors, we actually had to sit with the comments. We know how it feels individually to get reviews that can be negative, but we're also protective of the work. We're protective of the authors. We had to sit with the comments and think about, is this something that we even want to pass on? No, we don't want to break people's spirits. One negative comment could really, about someone's writing or what someone should be writing about. And, there were comments about an insider's perspective. And just hearing that language really calls to the need for guidelines and recommendations for editorial practices and processes. If someone doesn't understand the work as a reviewer, you shouldn't review the article. You are not an expert in this area. People need to make that clear. Those questions should be asked. Negative comments really demand highlighting and maybe not asking that person to review an article again. So I think, just thinking more about what are the practices and processes that we can do to make reviews more equitable is a piece in a conversation that we need to continue having.
I want to unpack that a bit more, and Patrick, ask you if you have comments on this, and really to share it with the panel to really help people understand, such that this insider conversation that could be taking place right now is really understood. So if we unpack this a bit further, when these works are going out for peer review, there are people in the field who can give green light or not. But we also know that in this field, it's been very hard for people of color to break through in the academy, and hard for Black people in the academy and people of color in the academy to do the work of focusing on people of color, because it's perceived that, some people are discouraged from writing about people of color across disciplines if they happen to be, because it's perceived as too insider, lazy, etc. And so what is interesting then, and again, maybe hard for people to digest, is that there's a lot of scholarship that's written about people of color that's written by non-people of color. And in those contexts, it's treated as legitimate and brilliant. And what a sacrifice for them to write about these matters addressing people of color. And at the same time, something that we've not talked about, but that is being lifted up in the wake of the horrific deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, et cetera, has been the effort to explore more equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging across scholarship. And people who have historically been able to get very high-end grants have now turned to people like you and others who say, consult with me so that now I can go and get a grant. So basically what I'm leading to is trying to help people to understand how these processes work, so that even now you have folks who can basically plug and play, consult you, and say, tell me about some of this stuff that people have never worked on before, and plug and play your knowledge into some grants. And then it's a cohort of people that may have very limited background and experience within this space, who become defined as the people who are experts, who then get the sign off on the work that you all do, or that other people who contribute to this work do. And that makes all of this complicated, I think, in these spaces. Anybody want to draw upon that or to speak to it at all?
Well, I'll certainly let my colleagues speak to those research questions, as we've had many conversations on that in the past. And you talked about this idea, Michele, just a few moments ago about resistance and the resistance of some of these type questions. And well, one thing first to the last part of your comments there and your question there. There has always been, unfortunately, this commodification of Black suffering. Right. Where too often people capitalize on Black suffering. Now, this is not to say that any research program or project or grant that people are undertaking to study these issues is at every turn, right, an instance of commodification of Black suffering, right? No, not saying that at all. But we also know the complexity of these kinds of issues and how oftentimes we want to take shortcuts to get to certain ends without doing the hard work that is needed. And this goes back to this notion of the resistance, right? So often when I think about this, the resistance of centering Black folks, Black suffering, and these questions of health justice, which I think is a very important part of the conversation, a couple of things come to mind. The first is, I think that notions of racism and how it works, how it is understood as an ideology, its deep connections to questions of economic exploitation is really under-theorized. right? So in a lot of ways, the way we don't even have a frame of reference to make the data that people are identifying in terms of healthcare disparities and some of these other questions intelligible, right? There's no frame of reference that makes it intelligible. And it does come across to some as simply being much ado about nothing, right? Because it's under theorized in the literature, the work of good theorists, ethicists, philosophers of race, who have been doing this work has not been incorporated and integrated in ways that I think that can help provide a frame of reference, right? So I do think, and maybe it's a little in the self-interest of people like Keisha Ray and myself, right? That philosophers are still needed, right? In this work and this role. And the other thing is a notion of kind of complicity, right? One of the things that Duke University through the Trent Center, the work of Jeff Baker, Damon Tweedy, many others are really just interrogating what is the history of the medical center with, let's say, the city of Durham or whatever local context you find yourself in, and really began to make accountable organizations and institutions at that localized level. I think that many institutions and every institution can really do that kind of work to see what that relationship is about, to interrogate those various practices. The challenge with those kinds of things, obviously, would be notions of complicity, right? And so then people are thinking about, well, what does this mean? What does this look like? Because I think at the end of the day, one of the questions that we do have to wrestle with in terms of health justice is what about notions of principles of redress, right? And all of this is bound up together, but I don't think we'll have movements to health justice without doing that hard work of going through that, and there are no shortcuts for that. But yeah, Keisha, Faith.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just briefly add in terms of sort of this conversation around picking scholars, Black scholars' brains. We've been hearing a lot about this, and it's something we've talked a lot about in terms of who's actually getting credit. And it's nice to be in a consultancy capacity, but we have to actually lead the projects and lead the work, which means that people have to invite us to lead the projects and lead the work. So, what we're calling for really in this report is just a change in leadership, an expansion of leadership to really include Black bioethicists in these positions. And it goes beyond just center directorships. It's also editorial boards. Take a look at your boards. Who's there, who's not there. Think about your leadership within bioethics journals, who needs to be there. So I think, we're at the stage where we're sort of, again, guest editing, but in order to really have sustainable change, we have to really embed our work, our perspectives throughout the field of bioethics in different ways. So that's, I think that's one area that we really need to continue. And this report really calls out some of those things. So I encourage you to, again, take a look at some papers that talk about centering Black scholars by Alicia Best. She really highlights this phenomenon of Black people not being acknowledged for their work in health equity work, not getting the funding, the identity work perspective that we really have to continue to push against that narrative. So I'll stop there. And I know Keisha has something to say.
Yeah, I'll just briefly add to, this is something that on other projects, Faith and I have worked on with other people, Sharika, Folashade, is to think about who's getting funded. We mentioned that briefly. So, again, this is a good point to show our appreciation for Greenwall and for Hastings, because these projects like this don't get done without someone putting their money where their mouth is, right? Someone has to fund these kinds of projects because if they don't, then they just don't get done, right? Our time is valuable, but then also just administrative costs. And then to think about costs in different ways. There are lots of people behind the scenes that are not here who put in the time to create call to action, to put in time to do press releases, right? And also thinking about our own time, we didn't just put this together and then shoot it off. We're doing webinars. We are also doing other sort of documents that are related to make sure that people see this. So there's lots of things that go into it. But one is it really requires money, requires funding, plainly speaking, and someone has to fund these kinds of projects. And then also thinking too, just about making sure that universities start to think about the kinds of projects that count towards tenure, the things that count towards promotion, the things that matter. We have to sort of change that too. And a part of that is taking into account narratives. I saw someone in the Q&A talk about narratives, and that's something that I'm very passionate about, is making sure that narratives are seen as legitimate scholarship. They're not seen as just anecdotal, but that to say that narratives don't matter really is anti-Black behavior. Really, I mean, because there's a lot to be known from narratives about the Black experience that is academic, that is scholarship. And one way to do that is to make sure that you are putting it forth in the classrooms, that we're putting it in our work. And so I think that it's super important to think about how you change what matters. And you can do that through narrative, you can do that through changing promotion structures, and you can do that through funding.
Well, on that notion, not that notion, but in terms of thinking about what is standardized, it seems to me that the experience that you're talking about as narrative, we understand it's legitimate often when it's not Black, right? Narrative is a crucial function, let's say, of the law. What do witnesses do? Witnesses provide a narrative. It's foundational. Narrative is understood and appreciated when we call it a qualitative aspect of sociology, that we are interviewing people and whatnot. Within anthropology, we call it ethnographic. But it seems to me that this is just another way in which you're highlighting the kind of delegitimizing of Black storytelling that is real life excavation of experiences. I can't help but think about in this conversation that which is also the psychological and emotional, which is very important, which informs the physical. And it reminds me of post-abolition of slavery, the revered practice of apprenticeship became harmonized as a tool of the South for the kind of revisiting of American slavery. And here's what I mean by that. In the South, there were platforms that were put in place whereby random white people could accost a Black family and literally take their child away and go before a magistrate and appeal that the parents had somehow been negligent. This reminds me of Professor Dorothy Roberts' current work, the work that she's been doing on Torn Apart. But they could appeal to a magistrate and say that this child needed what they could give, and that what they would give would be an apprenticeship for this child. Magistrates would sign off. And these were, kind of secondary forms of slavery, where these children could be taken away for 5, 10 years or more from their parents. And here's the point about narrative, which is that in the best articulation that these Black parents could have, they wrote to the Freedmen's Bureau, speaking urgently to give me my child back. How do I get my child back? It is a form of narrative, but it's a real life experience, and also something that is psychologically part of the legacy and intergenerational legacy. I want to turn to the Q&A before we wrap up, and also ask those who are participating that if they have questions, to put them in our Q&A. And I want to turn to a comment that is in the Q&A about the importance of excavating a foundation, and that if the house is unstable, how does one rebuild it? Or do you need to just knock the whole thing down and then curate from the beginning, start all over? Anybody who would like to address that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer briefly. We can get to your question, but I mean, yes, the answer is yes, right? And I think that's part of what part of the not compromising part that's even is in some of the articles in this special issue, is that part of it is how brave can we be? How brave can we be to say some of our systems just don't work and have to be dismantled and start over, right? And I think a lot of times people don't want to hear that. And I think part of, even in my own work, I've gotten pushback from editors or peer reviews that say, well, what's the middle ground? Like, tell us another solution, right? When I say this macro solution is to burn it all down, start over, and they want, well, give me something nice, right? And I think that's a part of this scholarship, is that people want the nice answer that's in the nice gift box. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's interrogate the foundations and start over if need be.
Anybody else want to address that before I go to the next question?
Yeah,
Go right ahead, Virginia.
I just want to say something about transformational scholarship. Okay, that it is a kind of inquiry into the work that we do, and I want to read this thought to you. True transformation for a transformative world. Where we're actually not band-aiding things, as Keisha spoke to, that we're actually sometimes you got to destroy it and build something anew. That worldview, that transformative worldview, holds that inquiry needs to be intertwined with politics. Those politics, as we've discussed them, are those sort of structural inequalities, and the kind of political change that a political change agenda to confront social oppression at whatever levels it occurs. That is the kind of work that we get to do. It asks the repeated question of what is it that bioethics owes justice. It owes it everything. It owes it a focus on social justice to transform and fundamentally change the way that we've engaged in health and healthcare.
I want to turn to another question that we've had in the Q&A, and this relates to what can journals, some of the most elite journals, seem to center the experiences and important questions with regard to health matters that people of color face. They tend to be centered in the editorial space. Can you address what that's meant by the person who puts that in, right? I want to hear from you. I have my own perspective on it, but this is about you all. And, what do you think about that, and what can be done to move the questions and the concerns and considerations with regard to health, bioethics, and people of color out of editorial and into the mainstream of our top journals? Who'd like to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I've been thinking about along with the other editors, and some of the things that we've talked about, even some of the things that I've written about. I think it's really up to journals to follow. They make a lot of declarations, and they'll say, we are committed to diversity. We are committed to dismantling racist practices, right? And I think that it is up to them to make sure that they are actually following through. And I've seen this happen at different journals that I'm on an editorial board for. They will create sort of mentorship programs to make sure that diverse scholars know what it takes to publish. And I think sometimes it's just a matter of education. But then also sometimes I really think that we have to sort of, which again takes on a burden, but we have to keep really pressing them to do better. And again, I acknowledge that this is a burden on those scholars that are already being pressed to make sure that the oppressor does a better job. But I do think that sometimes it can help. And I also think that sometimes it's really about creating a standard and then saying that we are going to make sure that this standard is upheld, but it's a standard, like there's a lot of the science journals are now creating guides for their peer reviewers and saying that if you are reviewing a paper that is about race or racism, this is one way that a guide that you can use to make sure that you are properly doing it. And they, on top of that, make sure that these articles go out to the proper reviewers, like Dr. Fletcher mentioned. You have to have the right reviewers for these articles, but then they also create these guides to sort of help. And then they have editors that make sure the guides are followed. And I've even served in sort of consult positions where I will be brought in to sort of look to see has this been done well? Is this reviewed to the proper standards? Does this guide even help reviewers to review papers that are about race and racism? So I think their journals are doing a better job, but there's also more to be done. And I think too, it matters who's on the editorial board, right? Because in my own positions and editorial boards, there have been times where I've called out and said, please do not send that email to the thousands of people in the listserv because this is racist, this isn't going to go over well. And you all don't see those emails. You see the email that got curated, by myself and some of my colleagues. But if I wasn't there, there could have been scandals. If people like Virginia, Faith, and Patrick weren't there, there could be these things. So also acknowledging the invisible labor that we are doing, because we are doing a lot for the journals. And I think, just it's a process, but that doesn't mean that you can't demand change, and you can't demand that journal editors and editorial boards take on the responsibility and do the work themselves.
Faith, I wondered if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you, Dr. Ray. And we have models of people that are actually journals that are doing it well. And I think we should really look to those models. And I want to highlight the Journal of Health Equity, the new editor-in-chief, Dr. Monica McLemore. And if you take a look at the editorial board, the deputy editor, the associate editors, you see racial ethnic diversity, you see diversity in terms of sexual identification even. So again, there are people that are transforming and really dismantling. And the question is, do we just get rid of everyone and just change completely? Well, this is what we're seeing. So I think it's just important as we think about addressing health and healthcare disparities that, again, we go back to who's doing it right and who's doing it well, and what can we learn from them.
I want to put a last couple questions to you before we begin to wrap up. And I hope we do this again, because this has been such an important conversation. Your work is not meant to simply sit on the shelf. This is a work that seems to me that very purposefully was thought of as something that is prescient, important, meant to influence, meant to carry on and be part of a legacy going forward. And so in lifting up something that's on my mind, and also one of the questions from one of our attendees, is the question about the importance of policymaking in all of this. Such that academia can be its own silo, right? Where people sit in their academic silos and are quite distant from the lived real world lives of people. So what is the role of this work in influencing public policy? Or stated differently, what would you want the impact to be in terms of public policy related to this work? And why don't I start with you, Patrick, and then just open it up in case anybody else would like to comment.
Yeah, I would just say quickly here that I would want this report, right, to be part of a larger body of research and discourse that says we have to attend very carefully and critically and in concrete ways to how anti-Black racism is impacting notions of health and health justice, and then begin to formulate policies around that in ways that can be enforceable. I am drawn towards those legal scholars' work, right? Those who are doing work in health justice, and people like, Dana Boyd Matthew over against other, as well as others, right? Who are trying to find ways to make sure that our civil rights legislation has teeth to it, that we have to go beyond just the intentions of people and organizations and institutions to actually looking at the real consequences that matter, and being able to recognize when we have these disparate outcomes, right, that we need to have policies in place that are trying to, one, mitigate that, but then two, also find ways to hold organizations and those of us accountable in ways that we can just be more attentive to or attend to these issues with a little bit more care and intentionality that's expressed beyond just the verbal commitment that we give to it.
Anybody want to add on to that before I go down with some very quick couple last wrap-up questions?
Yeah, I think this report really demonstrates that Black bioethicists should be leading conversations around health and healthcare inequity. So when we think about conversations with media or just generally contributing to scholarship, you have a list, a body of people who will also refer you to other people So when the question comes up in terms of us not being present or us not existing, we really sought to just challenge that narrative. And I think we did that here. So I'll just say that. In the other piece, and when we talk about policy, we can't do this work unless we have a change in institutional policy. We can't influence public discourse or health policy unless we're supported by our institutions. And we know that many institutions have started to make those changes. Like we can think about changes in community-based participatory research and how in other institutions, there's a different pathway for that, or public health practice, or even DEI work. Now we're seeing that, we're seeing this work being credited in promotion and tenure decisions. So we just have to keep that top of mind when we're thinking about having us doing this type of work that for some might view it as service related. This is your national service. Again, but we want to challenge that discourse. This is scholarship, and this is creating scholarship, and this is doing it at one of the highest levels. And I'm thankful for the opportunity to work with all of these amazing and brilliant people. I've learned so much from them. This has been a restorative space, and I, hope we continue to do this work together.
So before I get to the next question that was on my mind, I actually want to turn to something that you just mentioned, Faith, which it relates to structure. And 2 points with regard to structure in which you raised for me is one, who gets cited. And the second is who gets to be interviewed in this work, such that it's not all on you or those who've come before you. But really, when we think about interrupting what was, it's also a matter of responsibility in journalism and media to actually do the work and to actually find the people who are actually doing this work, and not just simply shift to the same old folks, the same people who've always been cited, but to actually do that effort of contacting scholars who work in this field and scholars of color who do this work and who have been doing this work. And Faith, I think you wanted to comment back on that.
Yeah, I mean, we've had this conversation amongst us, and I think we do a lot of recommendation. Keisha, someone will reach out and, we'll refer someone else. And yes, it is the responsibility of the media, but I also think it starts with us as Black scholars, not to accept every media request, because we know that there are other people that may be more appropriate to respond, more centered expertise. And I've experienced that with abortion. So it's like, yeah, I'm not the person to talk about abortion related issues. I do reproductive health work. And I think, again, that's a way of amplifying, elevating, and just, passing a recommendation on to someone else. And we have to do more of that. And Patrick talks about this a lot with white supremacy and how it tends to just allow one person to center one Black person, one person of color. And I think in our work, I mean, what we're trying to do is to show that we are a part of a collective. You can't just pick one of us out of the crowd and say, hey, you're our person. We're all of your people. We're all doing similar work, and we approach our work in different ways. So that's just one thought in terms of making sure that everyone is credited in their work and everyone's amplified, and making sure that one person is just not walking away as lead, and just so that's important to us, and this was important in our work.
Did anybody else want to add to that before just a couple of quick wrap-up questions?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. It's also a matter, everything Faith said was spot on, and it's also a matter of protection, because we've all seen it too easily with using like celebrity culture. Whenever there's the it person, the harder that they raise you, the harder that you fall, right? They sort of wait for you to mess up. And so I think that if we have a community behind ourselves, and you have the people speaking into the media who are the best representative of a topic, that is also a matter of self-preservation, just to put it crudely. But I think that it has to, I saw someone in the Q&A say, it also has to do, we have to do a little bit internal work, because I think sometimes we internalize that if someone else is getting the spoils of the job, then it makes me feel lesser than, or it makes me feel like I am not getting what I need. And so we have to do a little bit of internal work to say, just because someone else is succeeding doesn't mean that I am not also a success. And I think And again, that's a part of this white supremacist thinking that there can only be one. And if someone else is shining, then I must be dull. And that's just really not the case. But if you can have that community support behind you, it can help you to sort of let go of those things. But again, it's about finding your people.
Faith, I think I saw that you're okay. All right, that was next. All right. So I like to get to this point where I ask about what's going to be coming next in terms of a silver lining, but I want to mention a couple of things first, because we'd be remiss if we didn't. The first, Patrick, is that there was care and concern with the special report about the cover itself. What role does imagery play, and why is that important within the larger context of talking about how we visualize, thinking about race and bioethics, anti-Blackness and bioethics?
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you asked that question, Michelle, right? I mean, we actually had a cover art committee that was chaired by Vince Bonham. Faith was on that, Joanne Suarez, and they looked at hundreds of pieces of art from past generations, current generations, and they settled on a piece that was here by a young artist, brilliant artist out of the DC area, Wesley E. Clark. And the title of the cover art is "We Need." And it's a fascinating piece just to sit and kind of reflect on, and just thinking about this American project, right? And the metaphors we use about the American project, and what do we still need all these generations later, and wrestling with this. And so that committee settled on that particular piece. And one of the things about artists, whether it be in the Harlem Renaissance, the Civil Rights movements, the Black Lives Matter movements, artists have always leveraged the power of the arts to illuminate injustice and to stimulate some dialogue, to drive collective action, to engage in the process of moral motivation, to help create the social conditions such that trust can be restored. All of this is the role that the arts can play, and artists in particular. And I do think that part of the continuing legacy of doing this work well is making sure that we're taking seriously the intersections of arts in medicine. Toni Morrison, thinking as a literary artist, right, from The Nation, a couple of decades ago, right, when she was, concerned about the political climate. And the idea was that in times of moral, spiritual, and political upheaval, right, she was encouraged by colleagues of hers and friends of hers not to despair, not to be discouraged, because it is at that time that artists go to work, that they do language, that they do what they are uniquely gifted and tasked to do. And I think the same thing can be said with the visual artist, musical artist as well. And I just think that this is just a medium that we need to incorporate because it does so much. And I could go on and on about that, so I think I better stop now and censor myself.
Well, I'm glad that you did mention that. I did say that I'm here in Zurich and for a series of medical meetings that have started with cellist playing, right? Again, this importance of understanding that how we come to our work and how we understand it can be informed and influenced by the arts. Faith, the question that I wanted to ask you before I ask you all about a silver lining coming forward, and then close with reading another passage that I want to from the introduction. So, Faith, there was a task force that was associated with this, and I think that that's also important because a point that you have emphasized over and over again has been collectivity, around not centering just one voice, understanding that there is a field, understanding that this has been intergenerational work, understanding that many voices come together and that they should be acknowledged. And so I know that that would be something important to you. So could you just speak to the task force that was a part of this?
Yeah, we had a brilliant task force that really, again, helped to anchor this work. And at some point, we'll have to have a conversation with them so that they can share their reflections. But, there's one thing about doing this work, we have to do it collectively. And there were things that we just didn't know. There were things that we didn't have access to, for instance, to creating a Black agenda conference list. Dr. Stephen Shadecki had that, stories that we were not aware of. So it really warranted having this diverse group of people. And in the future, we hope that we can start to influence the way and change editorial practices. So when you're developing a report, we do this with in our research community-based work, and Virginia's done a lot of this as well, from the beginning, from the conceptualization all the way through dissemination. It requires a little more time. It requires more consensus. I know there are times where I'm sure Hastings was like, do you have to go back to everyone and ask this question? And we understand it, but we also recognize in this process, in this work, it requires interdisciplinary perspectives and diverse perspectives to really carry it out. So I think this is just one way, one model of doing it. And we hope to really document this in our process in the future.
And a conversation that's gone much too quickly today. All right, so final question for you all. And this is it's a quick one, but what do you see as a vision of hope or a silver lining going forward, given that what we started off with and what we've talked about are articulations of Black suffering intergenerationally, the hardship with bringing this work to fruition and forward. And yet at the same time, I see this as a very hopeful endeavor and project. And so if we could just go through a quick piece about just what you see going forward. And I'm going to start with you, Virginia. What do you see as a silver lining or space going forward that offers some lens of hope?
Well, I think that before I can get there is rest. Is needed to get to that silver lining. I think what's possible is that there's this concrete thing that got done. When to be able to look back and say we did this, okay, is a reminder that we can do more. That the possibility is there for more. So there's a silver lining. There is a community. We are there. We are named. Patrick is going to name everyone for us as at the end. I know you know this, but it's so important. It's the possibility is possible. That's the silver lining for me.
Thank you so much for that. Keisha, what do you see as a silver lining message of hope going forward?
I think the report itself is hope. It shows that there is good work being done, that Black scholars are working together to create this awesome scholarship, and that people are listening. The participants being here is hope, that people are wanting to listen, and that people care, and people want to take these ideas to their institutions and maybe do their own special reports, or maybe write their own articles, or maybe put in their own teaching or their own community development. The fact that we're here, I think is hope. So I think there's change happening, and I think we have to acknowledge that there's a lot more to go, and we can get so bogged down in the what's next, but I think we need to look at what's happening right here in the moment.
Patrick, I'd like to turn to you.
Right. And Dr. Ray hit my words. One of the things that gives me hope is the fact that we're still here. Right. I come from a tradition where people tell the story, right? They give the roll call of those who've come before, and then they can end up with through it all, right? We're still here, despite the hardships, despite the challenges, despite the fact that we still have to write a report dealing with these issues. We are still here. And so for me, this notion of hope, it is not a kind of optimism. So I reject that notion of optimism being related to hope. It is not a kind of blind historical determinism that things are just going to work out. There has to be a deep sense of intentionality. There has to be a deep sense of rolling up our sleeves, wanting to get the work done. And hope comes in the fact that we can imagine a world that is different than it currently is now. That's what sustains us in doing the work of justice and health. If we could not envision the world being different than it is right now, then what is it that sustains us in doing the work with all the burdens that come with it? So for me, where the hope is in the fact that we are still here and that we still have a moral imagination that can envision the world being different than it is right now.
All right, and I'm going to conclude my questions with you, Faith. Silver lining, message of hope.
Yes, that we can work together despite institutional and disciplinary barriers that keep us working in silos, and that we can actually produce the work. I know early on, Patrick's like, hey, let's not announce this until we actually start to get some things on paper, because we don't want to be the people known not to carry something out. I mean, we have that burden that we carry. And I think just showing the versatility of Black scholars, of our work, the interdisciplinary nature, that's important. We're not a monolith. And I think that's something that this report really shows, that we're all doing equity, justice related work, but we approach our work differently. So happy that we were able to work together. And again, it's restorative, and we hope to continue to carry this work out.
And
Doctors
before we wrap
Keisha
up,
Ray,
sorry, go ahead.
Doctors Keisha Ray, Patrick Smith, Faith Fletcher, and Virginia Brown, I want to thank you for participating today. It's been my honor and my pleasure. And before I cede the stage, let me just close with a passage taken from the special report introduction. In the 1962 essay, As Much Truth as One Can Bear, a manifesto written to literary artists about their role during times of social and political upheaval, the novelist, playwright, and social critic James Baldwin declared, and I quote, "We are the generation that must throw everything into the endeavor to remake America into what we say we want it to be. Without this endeavor, we will perish. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Baldwin's plea still speaks to us, you wrote. For those of us in the field of bioethics who recognize that racism continues to affect every aspect of our collective life, including our work in the field, it is every bit as relevant now as it was 6 decades ago, before bioethics had begun. If we bioethicists seek to transform the field of bioethics, we must do the inner work needed to cultivate an anti-racism ethos and to generate the collective social and political will, you wrote, within the field to address the systemic issues surrounding racism and health. And I applaud you for your indefatigable, courageous, and important work with this special report. It has been my honor and privilege to be with you today, and now I will turn it over.
Thank you all for that conversation. And before we end the webinar, we want to turn to Misty Anderson from the Greenwall Foundation to hear about the importance of this work again.
Thank you, and I'll be very quick. I'm processing this tremendous conversation from the past 2 hours. What an experience. I'd just like to say that the Greenwall Foundation is incredibly proud to have sponsored this special report and the robust collection of scholarship that it features, which feels even more salient after listening to this deeply personal conversation today, with everything the panelists brought to the fore to share with all of us who are viewing. And I really look forward to the continuation of this conversation over the coming weeks, months, years, as it must continue. And then finally, I'd just like to thank the Hastings Center for hosting this webinar, for Dr. Goodwin for moderating, for all of the panelists for this deep, informative, and meaningful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you all for joining this event today, and thank you to everyone who spoke today. The link to the special report can be found in the Q&A, and a video recording will be available shortly at www.thehastingscenter.org. So we hope that you all have a great rest of your day, and thank you again for coming.
Thank you.